A poor girl is fired from a luxury boutique for helping a shabby old man. Unbeknownst to anyone, he's a billionaire in disguise. One small act of kindness unlocks the door to a destiny that pulls her into a world of wealth, deception, and unexpected love. But is kindness enough to survive in a world built on illusion? New York on a gloomy morning, snow speckling the marble-paved streets and the sound of high heels echoing coldly across the floor of a luxurious boutique. Emily Carter stepped inside as usual, her old gray coat clinging tightly to her thin frame. She smiled, not out of joy, but because she had learned to use a smile to mask her wounds. Maison de Luxe Boutique was unlike any place Emily had ever worked. It was like a modern palace. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers reflecting light like dancing diamonds. Every dress here was worth a fortune, and every person who walked in belonged to a world Emily could never touch. Emily was a stranger in that world. She worked hard, never late, never complaining, but that meant nothing to Monica Harris, her manager. Monica was the embodiment of artificial authority. Tight dresses, red lipstick, designer heels, and a gaze dripping with contempt. She didn't bother hiding her disdain for Emily. "Emily?" Monica's voice sliced like a knife. "The display room hasn't been wiped down again, and who's going to get my coffee?" Emily swallowed her retort and gave a slight nod. She was used to it, the coffee maker, the floor wiper, the dress organizer, but never the salesperson. Never part of the prestigious fashion specialist team here. Every time Emily dared to step near a potential customer, she was brushed aside, gently but firmly, by sharp-edged colleagues like Rachel or Kim, who carried the scent of expensive perfume and invisible ambition. "That poor girl," they'd whisper. "She belongs in the stockroom or out of sight." Emily used to cry, not anymore. She just quietly went to work and quietly left, her cheap shoes worn at the heels, her once bright dreams now tucked away in the drawer of her heart. She needed this job. Rent, her mother's medicine, daily food, everything weighed heavily on her shoulders. But despite the mistreatment, Emily couldn't shed her kindness. She smiled at people who never met her eyes. She picked up shards of glass from a broken mirror, even when no one asked. She made Monica's coffee just sweet enough, though she was scolded every day. Sometimes she wondered, am I really living, or am I just a side character in someone else's life? One winter morning, as the snow melted and the sun timidly peeked out, Emily stood in a corner of the boutique, carefully arranging silk dresses on their hangers. The soft light filtered through her dark brown hair, making her look like a forgotten painting. She didn't know that, just a few hours later, this quiet, humiliating life would come to an end. A door would open. A person would step in, dressed in poverty and carrying weary eyes. That person, whom no one could have expected, would become the bridge leading Emily to an entirely different world, but also the greatest challenge of her life, and that precisely was where it all began. The wind chimes tinkled as the boutique's door swung open. No one looked up immediately. Wealthy customers came and went here like it was routine, their luxurious perfume lingering stronger than the scent of morning coffee. But this time, that scent didn't come. Emily turned around, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to freeze. An old man stood at the entrance. He wore a faded, tattered coat, his shoulders slumped from time and bitter winds. His silver hair was wild and unkempt, as if he'd walked miles through the snow, his shoes torn enough to expose his toes. He didn't belong here, that much was clear. Rachel glanced up, her meticulously lined eyes narrowing. "Sorry," she said with a dismissive sneer. "This is a high-end boutique, not a charity shop." Kim snickered, her laugh sharp like a blade. "He's lost." Emily stood there, her heart tightening. She knew that feeling, the sensation of an entire room turning its back on you at once. The old man said nothing for a moment. Then, with a hoarse voice as soft as a breeze, he whispered, "I just wanted to look around a little." Instantly, Monica appeared like a specter drenched in Chanel No. 5. Her sharp eyes scanned the old man from head to toe, lingering on his tattered shoes. A faint, escaped her nose. "Sir," Monica said, her tone laced with polite sarcasm, "we cater to the elite, people who know what they want and can afford it. You understand, don't you?" The old man's gaze remained gentle, but those eyes strangely deep, as if he'd seen the entire world and was now seeing through every person in this room. "Child," he turned to Emily, the only one who hadn't stepped back, "could you get me some water?" That simple question, amid a sea of scornful stares, rang out like a quiet challenge. Emily nodded without hesitation. She walked to the back, poured a glass of cold water, and returned. "Please, have a seat," she said softly. "Drink slowly. It's cold outside." Monica glared. Rachel shook her head. Kim whistled. "My God, she's actually treating this old guy like a VIP." Emily ignored them. She placed the glass in the old man's hands, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cool crystal. The deep wrinkles etched into his skin were like untold stories. "Thank you, child," he said. "You're the first person to be kind to me today." Emily smiled, though her heart ached. She knew that feeling, the feeling of being invisible, as if the world had forgotten you existed. "Rest here for a bit," she said quietly. "It's fine." The old man took a sip of water, then suddenly looked up. "Do you think I could try on a few suits?" The room fell deathly silent. Monica smirked. Rachel held her breath. Kim burst into laughter. "Suits," she hissed. "We don't let customers like you try things on. You'll dirty the fabric." Emily stood still. She didn't laugh. She didn't urge the old man to leave and spare them the trouble. Instead, she nodded. "Of course. What kind would you like? A cashmere coat or an Italian suit?" Monica stepped forward, her heels clacking sharply against the marble floor. "That's enough," she snapped. "Emily, have you lost your mind?" But the old man smiled, a faint, slow, and very mysterious smile. "Could you pick out 10 of the finest ones for me?" Emily froze. 10? "Yes," he nodded. "I want the best." The room erupted in a mix of stunned and scornful laughter, and Emily just stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what had just begun. The laughter in the boutique echoed like needles, piercing the dignity of a human being. Emily still stood there, beside the old man in his tattered clothes. She quietly nodded and bent down to select each suit, as if he were the most esteemed customer she'd ever served. She didn't look at Monica. She didn't hear the whispers of her colleagues. She focused only on his eyes, eyes that were weathered and strangely melancholic. An hour later, when a pile of suits had been laid out, the old man smiled with satisfaction. "You've chosen well," he said. "I'll take them all." Emily paused. That's $225,000 total." No one breathed. The room seemed to stop moving. Then the old man casually patted his coat pocket. "Oh, it seems I forgot to bring money," he chuckled softly. "Can you wait for me to meet my grandson to get it?" Laughter erupted like fireworks. Monica nearly choked from laughing. Rachel clutched her stomach. Kim clapped her hands. "A rich grandson?" Monica repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you've got a palace in the clouds, too, right?" Emily didn't laugh. She simply bowed her head, reached into her purse, and pulled out the last bit of money she had. "Here, take this, at least for a taxi home." No one said a word. The old man froze. His frail, trembling hand hesitated as it grasped the crumpled bills. You really trust me?" Emily smiled, her eyes tinged with red. "I don't know anything about you, but I know what it's like to be looked down on." Then Monica shouted, "Enough! You not only dared to serve a homeless man in a high-end boutique, but you gave him money too? You're tarnishing the store's image. You're fired." Emily didn't argue. She just bowed her head, gathered her bag, and turned to leave. As she walked out, she didn't know. Someone was watching her, with a gaze full of contemplation. 1 hour later, an old taxi pulled up in front of a massive gold-plated gate. The driver stared in disbelief at the lavish mansion before him. This is your house?" he asked. The old man only smiled and nodded. Through marble steps, past a garden, like something out of a painting, he stepped into a grand hall adorned with crystal chandeliers and red carpets. A young man in a black suit, his eyes sharp as a blade, hurried forward. "Grandfather, where have you been since this morning?" The old man, none other than George Miller, founder of the Miller Lux Group, took off his faded felt hat and smiled. "Today, I met an angel disguised as an ordinary person." Nathan Miller, his grandson, the young CEO, frowned. "You were testing people again, weren't you?" "Yes," George sighed. "And they all failed, except for a girl named Emily." George recounted every detail. The way Monica insulted him, the way the staff mocked him, and the way Emily, the only one with nothing to her name, chose kindness over judgment. Nathan stayed silent for a long time. Then he turned to his personal assistant. "Richard, pull the store's camera footage and find the girl named Emily Carter. I want to meet her. Immediately." George smiled with deep satisfaction. "You won't regret it." A sleek black car glided to a stop along the curb, pausing in front of the run-down apartment building like a swan lost among crows. Emily Carter stood frozen before the vehicle, her hand instinctively tightening around the strap of her worn fabric bag. She had never seen a luxury car come anywhere near her, let alone stop right at her doorstep. The car window rolled down. A man in a refined gray suit gave a slight nod. "Miss Emily Carter?" Emily nodded, her voice hesitant. "Yes, that's me. I'm Richard, assistant to Mr. Nathan Miller, CEO of the Miller Lux Group. He'd like to meet you." Emily's entire body stiffened. Nathan Miller? The man featured on the cover of Forbes? The one all of America called the most powerful bachelor billionaire? There must be some mistake. "There's no mistake, miss," Richard replied, gentle but firm. "Mr. Miller knows exactly who you are." Every instinct in Emily screamed, "Don't go." But a deeper voice whispered back, "Opportunities don't knock twice." And so, she got into the car. The gates of the Miller estate swung open, ushering in a new world. A place where warm golden lights reflected off a glass-like lake, where people addressed each other as Sir and Madam, a realm Emily had always thought existed only in far-off movies. She stepped out of the car, her heart pounding like a drum. Before her stretched a white stone staircase leading up to a towering mansion where a man stood waiting. Tall, cold, and strikingly familiar. Nathan Miller. He was even more handsome than in the magazines, but it wasn't his looks that made Emily take a step back. It was his gaze, the gaze of someone accustomed to deciding others' fates. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, steady, and clear. "I'm Nathan." Emily swallowed hard. "I don't understand. Why am I here?" "Because you did something no one else in that store could. You were kind to my grandfather." Emily's heart clenched. He's really your grandfather?" Nathan gave a slight nod. "And he's the most important person in my life." He extended a hand, an invitation. "Come inside. I have something to discuss." Inside, crystal chandeliers cast shimmering bands of light across the soaring, domed ceiling. Emily sat on a plush velvet sofa, too nervous to lean back. Everything here was too perfect, too foreign, and too fragile. Nathan sat across from her. "I need a personal assistant, and I want it to be you." Emily choked on her words. "But I don't have a prestigious degree. No experience with big companies. But you have something no one here does. Character." A pause, then Nathan spoke softly. "I watched the footage. I saw how you gave my grandfather a glass of water. How you smiled despite being humiliated." Emily looked down. "I didn't do anything special." "That's exactly what makes it special." The door swung open. A woman strode in, her high heels clacking sharply against the marble floor. A red dress hugged her frame, and her perfume was so strong it nearly claimed the room. Her face was beautiful and cold. "Oh," she purred, her voice sweet like honey laced with venom. "Do we have a guest?" Emily shot to her feet. Nathan didn't need to introduce her. The woman did it herself with her sheer presence. "Victoria Blake," she said, her eyes raking Emily from head to toe. "Old friend and longtime associate of Nathan's." "Miss Emily is my grandfather's guest," Nathan said, his gaze fixed on Victoria, "and, starting today, my personal assistant." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Really?" She let out a soft laugh, the sound like nails scraping glass. "A nobody? No background? What are you planning to turn her into, Nathan? A modern Cinderella?" Emily clenched her fists, but Nathan stood, stepping in front of her. "She doesn't need to turn into anything. She's already herself, and that's enough for me to trust her." Victoria's gaze darkened. For the first time, her smile vanished, and Emily, stepping into this opulent world for the first time, realized something. Kindness wasn't a free pass. It was a mirror that made the pretenders tremble. The storm, it seemed, had only just begun. Emily never thought she could get used to this world, a world of thick velvet curtains, breakfast served on real silver, silent staff, and whispers that could alter destinies. But then, she began to find herself smiling each morning as she brewed coffee for George. She learned to skim reports quickly, organize files meticulously, and work alongside Nathan as if they'd been a team for years. She didn't see Victoria much in that first week, and that was a relief. But peace at the Miller estate was never meant to last. One morning, as Emily prepared to leave the mansion for the office, a scream pierced the air from the second-floor hallway. "No way! The royal necklace is gone!" The staff panicked. Security guards immediately sealed the main doors. An hour later, Emily's room was flooded with people, security personnel, the butler, and Victoria. On Emily's bed lay an open black velvet box. Inside was the blue diamond necklace, a Miller family treasure worth over $3 million. "No way," Emily whispered, her face drained of color. Victoria crossed her arms, feigning sorrow. I really didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is clear." Emily turned to Richard. "I didn't take it. I didn't even know where it was." "We'll investigate thoroughly," Richard said firmly, though his eyes betrayed confusion. George entered, leaning on his cane, his face taut with tension. "No one is to draw conclusions until everything's clear." But the whispers had already begun. Honestly, it's not that surprising. "Where's she from again? Some poor part of Brooklyn?" "She looks innocent, but maybe she's a fox in sheep's clothing." Emily stood in the icy room, their stares piercing her like arrows. Even if she screamed her innocence 100 times, who would believe her? And then Nathan walked in. The room fell deathly silent. Emily looked at him, her eyes red and brimming with fragile hope, but Nathan said nothing. His face was cold, his gaze so complex it was unreadable. That was the cruelest moment. Not the false accusation, but the silence from the one person she'd hoped would defend her. Emily took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and spoke in a trembling but resolute voice. "I'm leaving. Not because I'm guilty, but because I don't belong here." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't look back. She just walked past the doubtful gazes, down the granite steps that once felt like a dream. The wind cut like a blade, but it didn't hurt as much as the sting of betrayed trust. That night, Emily returned to her tiny rented room, where the dim yellow light flickered and the sound of traffic seeped through the old window. She sat alone on her bed, clutching her phone as if waiting for a call one she knew would never come. A tear fell onto her palm. She wasn't crying because she'd lost her job, not because she'd been humiliated. She cried because, for the first time in her life, she'd dared to believe she deserved something good. And that had been snatched away in an instant. At the Miller estate, Nathan sat alone in his study, staring at a screen replaying security footage no one knew he was quietly reviewing. A shadow, a stealthy movement. His eyes darkened. "Victoria," he whispered. A spark flared in his gaze. Not anger, but fire. Nathan's office was bathed in the dim blue glow of the large screen. The footage played in slow motion, frame by frame, second by second, step by step, every movement captured. And then, there she was, Victoria. Her wavy hair, red dress, and wary eyes as she snuck into the jewelry display room at midnight. She carefully opened the case, slipped the diamond necklace into her bag, and vanished. But the camera in Emily's hallway caught something else. Victoria sneaking into Emily's room just minutes later. Nathan stopped breathing. His face darkened, no longer the composed CEO, but a man ignited with silent fury. He shot to his feet. "Richard," he called through the intercom, his voice low and steely. "I want everyone in the mansion at the Grand Hall, including my mother and especially Victoria." When Victoria stepped into the hall, the room was already packed, from gardeners to the company's vice president. Margaret, Nathan's mother, sat on a gilded chair, her expression stern. Victoria entered with a confident smile. "Nathan, I heard you wanted to see everyone." Nathan nodded but didn't look at her. Instead, he signaled Richard. The lights dimmed. The large screen flickered to life. A video began to play. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly. When the footage of Victoria stealing the necklace appeared in stark clarity, a sharp gasp escaped from his mother. "Victoria," Margaret whispered, eyes wide. Victoria paled. "No, that's not me. It's edited fake." Nathan stepped forward, his gaze icy. "I checked the security codes. Fingerprints, backup cameras. Nothing's fake." He scanned the room. Emily was the one wronged. Silence. "And I," Nathan continued, "let her leave without doing anything. That was the biggest mistake of my life." That evening, Emily sat alone in her small apartment. A blanket draped over her legs, a cold cup of tea in her hands. She'd been trying to move on. She sent out resumes, she went to interviews. She tried not to think about Nathan's eyes when he stayed silent. A knock sounded at the door. She opened it, and her heart nearly stopped. Nathan Miller stood there, no bodyguards, no luxury car, just Nathan. The man she'd once trusted, then felt betrayed by, and now didn't know how to face. Emily stepped back slightly. "What are you doing here?" "To apologize," Nathan said, his gaze softening, "and to say something I should have said long ago." He stepped inside, standing in the middle of her modest room with its stained ceiling and creaky window rattling in the wind. No more grandeur, no more power, just the truth. "You showed my grandfather kindness when the world turned its back on him. You worked without complaint, pushed forward even when looked down upon. You're the only one who never exploited, never pretended, never demanded." Emily stayed silent, her eyes welling up. "And you stayed quiet when I needed you most." Nathan nodded, honest. "I was afraid. Afraid if I spoke up and was wrong, I'd lose the trust of my entire family, but by staying silent, I lost you." He stepped closer, taking her hand, thin, cold, but trembling just like the first day they met. "Emily," he said, looking straight into her eyes, "I love you." Emily couldn't react. Her heart seemed to stop. Nathan squeezed her hand gently, his breath shaky. "I don't care where you're from, what you wear, how many degrees you have. I only care about one thing. You've made me a better man." Silence. Then, slowly, Emily nodded. "I love you too," she whispered. "But I don't want love to be something that proves who's right or wrong." "No," Nathan said with a faint smile. "Love is what gives us the courage to make things right." And then he kissed her, not in front of a crowd, not for the cameras, but in the small room where two hearts no longer had to hide. Emily's wedding day unfolded under the gentle autumn sunlight, a light distilled from the last golden threads of summer, shimmering, warm, and fragile, much like her own story. The gates of the Miller mansion swung wide, welcoming hundreds of guests, politicians, celebrities, and tycoons from across the globe. Yet the center of every gaze wasn't on those illustrious names. It was her, Emily Carter, the girl once chased out of a shop, who lived in a crumbling apartment, who was falsely accused and quietly left in the cold. Today, she stepped out of a pristine white wedding car, wearing a dazzling couture gown adorned with silver diamonds. But her eyes, they remained the same, gentle, deep, and profoundly humble. The entire hall rose as Emily entered the chapel, arm in arm with George, the man who had set this whole story in motion and chosen her from the very start. As the organ swelled, he whispered to her, "You're not Cinderella, Emily. You're proof that kindness is the most beautiful crown." She squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. At the end of the white flower-strewn aisle stood Nathan, in a classic black tuxedo, his gaze never leaving her for a single second. It was no longer the look of a cold CEO, but that of a man who knew full well the most precious thing in his life wasn't locked in a safe or tied to stocks. It was walking toward him, step by step. The ceremony unfolded with deep emotion. When the priest asked, "Do you vow to stand by her, in wealth or poverty, in health or sickness, in glory or hardship?" Nathan didn't just say, "I do." He whispered, "You stood by me when nothing bound us. Now it's my turn to do that for you, forever." Emily smiled, clear tears slipping down not from sadness but because her heart had never felt so light. The reception took place in the lavender garden, where the sunset cast an amber glow over every petal, every crystal glass, and every congratulatory embrace. She walked past those who had once mocked her, doubted her, and now bowed their heads in respect. In a corner, Monica, Emily's old manager, stood frozen, clutching her purse tightly. On the giant LED screen, the bride's journey played out, from her first day at the boutique to the moment she was fired, to today, becoming Nathan Miller's wife. The final words on the video were George's voice. "I didn't choose her because she was beautiful. I chose her because when no one saw me, she still did and understood." Late that night, as fireworks lit up the sky, Emily and Nathan stood together on the mansion's highest balcony, gazing down at the city sinking into a radiant glow. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Nathan asked. "Yes," Emily said with a soft laugh. "You were silent. I thought you were like everyone else. And now?" She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Now I know silence can be the heart's way of speaking when it's not yet brave enough to admit it." Nathan held her closer. In a world full of gossip, ambition, and noise, it was just the two of them, honest, tender, and complete. No magic needed, just the right person.